It was raining, as if the sky was trying to wash away all the dirt of this world, but neither the elements nor the wet asphalt could extinguish the fire that was burning between Sophia and Alexei. They raced along the night highway at a speed that was already a risk in itself. But this was not enough to quench their passion. Sophia laughed, throwing her head back, and Alexei looked at her, not hiding his desire. They flew along the night road, their car tearing through the night air, as did their hearts, half with fear, half with delight. Their love was forbidden, dangerous, and that's what made it so attractive. Alexei, hardly taking his eyes off Sophia, reached out to her. She leaned forward and their lips met in a passionate kiss. Hands were shaking, emotions were raging. They kissed as if the world outside the car had ceased to exist. Alexei pressed the steering wheel, but his eyes were fixed not on the road, but on her. Sophia was sitting next to her, her long hair falling over her face and her lips slightly quivering with excitement. Her heart beat faster than the sound of rain outside the window. "You're crazy, Alexei," she whispered as he let go of the steering wheel for a moment to touch her knee. His hand was hot, his touch burning. "If so, it's because of you," he answered hoarsely, leaning closer. Sophia turned to him and their eyes met. There was everything in this look. Fear, desire, and despair. She knew it was wrong, knew their romance was a betrayal that would ruin everything. But it was not guilt that stopped her, but thirst. "Stop the car," she said, but her voice was low and unsteady. "No, I can't stop when you're around," he answered, and those words were a real challenge. He leaned closer, and she couldn't resist. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, full of everything they had been holding back for so long. Their kiss was not only passion, but also a rebellion against the world, against the rules, against themselves. Suddenly, the downpour lit up the road. The silhouette of a man appeared right in front of the hood. "Alexei! Carefully!" Sophia shouted, sharply turning her head forward. Alex instinctively hit the brakes, but it was too late. The impact sounded like thunder, and the car came to a screeching halt, throwing them out of their trance back into reality. Sophia hit the panel, but not hard. An oppressive silence hung in the cabin, broken only by the sound of rain. "What was that?" Her voice shook as she struggled to unbuckle her belt. The car stopped with a sharp jerk. The wheels skidded on the wet road. Sophia was breathing heavily. Her heart was pounding in her chest as if it was trying to escape. Alexei was silent. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, and his eyes were fixed on the road ahead. A man was lying in front of the car on the wet asphalt. His body looked helpless like a doll thrown to the ground. The rain continued to pour, drops running down his face, but he did not move. Is he dead?" Sophia whispered, her voice shaking. She touched Alexei's hand, but he did not respond. Alexei finally unbuckled his seatbelt and carefully got out of the car. Sophia stayed inside, clutching her purse as if it could protect her. She watched as Alexei came closer to the man, bent down, and, holding his breath, reached out to his neck to check his pulse. "Lyosha?" Sophia asked quietly. Alex straightened up sharply, his face turned pale and his eyes wide. He took a step back, as if he didn't want to be closer to the body. "He's not moving. There's no pulse," he finally said, but his voice was hollow, almost emotionless. "What will we do?" Sophia felt the cold creeping into her chest. Panic began to drag her into its vortex. Alexei looked around. The rain was getting heavier, and the road around them was deserted. No witness, no other car. Everything around seemed as if from another world. Dark, hostile. "We'll go," he said sharply, returning to the car. No one saw it. "What? Lyosha, this is wrong! We have to call the police!" Sophia raised her voice, but there was no confidence in her words. Her hands were trembling, and her gaze was moving between her body and Alexei. "And what shall we tell them? That it was an accident? What if they decide that we are guilty? Do you want to destroy everything? Do you want your husband to know about it?" His voice sounded sharp and cold, like a blade. Sophia fell silent. Alexei's words hit her in a weak spot. She knew that the truth could destroy not only her life, but everything they had hidden for so long. "We didn't do anything on purpose, Sophia. Just get in the car, now." His tone became insistent. She hesitated, but then obeyed. Her heart was heavy, but fear outweighed everything else. They got into the car, and Alexei sharply pressed the gas. The car sped away, leaving the man's body behind, disappearing into the darkness of the rainy night. The car sped along the wet road, breaking the silence between them. Sophia looked out the window, her eyes fixed on the rain-smeared lanterns. Her mind was racing with thoughts. Did they do the right thing? Was the man really dead? And if not? "You are silent," Alexei interrupted her thoughts, not taking his eyes off the road. His voice was strained but calm. "Do you think we did something terrible?" "We did something terrible," Sophia answered sharply. Her voice trembled. "We left him there without even being fully convinced." Alexei pressed the gas pedal even harder, as if he wanted to escape not only from the road, but also from her words. "We had no choice, Sophia. If the police find us, it's over. Do you understand that?" She didn't answer anything. Her hands were clutching the seatbelt so hard that her fingers turned white. She was troubled by one detail. Before they got into the car, she thought she saw the man's fingers twitch. Maybe it was just a reflex? Did that mean he was alive? "What are you going to do now?" she asked, trying to control her emotions. "Go home. No one will find out." His voice was harsh. "We will meet tomorrow and decide how to proceed. But for now, forget about it." Sophia wanted to object, but fear and tension forced her to remain silent. She turned her head to the window, trying to quell her guilt. Alexei drove Sophia home in silence. Their car stopped at her driveway, but neither of them was in a hurry to break the silence. Sophia stared at her shaking hands, trying to gather her thoughts. Alexei kept aloof. His gaze was directed forward, but the tension in his jaw showed that he too was on the edge. "Are you sure that you can be alone?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the windshield. "Yes," she answered quietly, though deep down she knew it wasn't true. "I have to think, just to be alone." Alexei nodded and, without saying another word, waited until she got out of the car. As the door closed, Sophia saw him slam on the gas and disappear into the darkness. The apartment was quiet and cold, as if absorbing her anxiety. Sophia took off her wet coat and threw it on the floor. There was no sound in the room except for the faint sound of raindrops still falling from the windows. She pulled out her phone, trying to dial Artem's number, but the call remained unanswered. Her husband was not at home, and his phone had been silent for several hours. It was strange, because Artem always reported if he was late at work or was busy. "Where are you, Artem?" she whispered, looking at the screen in confusion. She tried again, but to no avail. The feeling of loneliness came over her with a new force. The body was trembling, and thoughts about the events of that night did not give rest. It seemed to her that she heard a dull thump again, saw the motionless body of a man on the road. Sophia walked around the apartment, trying to find something to distract her. She switched on the lights in the living room, put the kettle on, and switched on the TV. But even the sound of the news couldn't quell her anxiety. Hours passed, but sleep never came. Sophia was sitting on the couch with her knees wrapped around her, her eyes fixed on the phone. One half of her heart prayed that Artyom would call, and the other was afraid that something might happen to him. Sophia was sitting on the edge of the couch holding the phone, which had been her only hope for several hours. She dialed number after number, but each time the line went silent. Her husband, Artem, did not answer. No calls, no messages. She tried again, even though she knew the result would be the same. The clock showed 2 in the morning. Her nerves were on edge. She had already walked around the apartment several times, peering into the windows as if hoping to see his silhouette behind the door. But every time, nothing. Sophia decided to call one of his friends. She chose Igor's number, with whom Artem often worked on projects. "Hello?" His voice sounded sleepy. "Igor, sorry for the late call, but you don't know where Artem is? He's not answering his calls and he's not at home," she said hurriedly, trying not to panic. "Sophia? No, I didn't see him today. The last time we talked was yesterday afternoon. Did something happen?" he asked, already fully awake. "No, I don't know. He just doesn't get in touch. Maybe he told you something about some plans for the evening?" "No, nothing like that. Try to call Dima, maybe he knows more," suggested Igor. "Okay, thanks," she replied and ended the call. Sophia immediately dialed Dima's number, but uncertainty awaited her here as well. He also did not know anything and did not hear from Artem during the day. Her anxiety only increased. Hours passed, but there were no answers. Sophia was sitting in the kitchen, drinking already cold tea and thinking about what to do next. Her hands were shaking, and her thoughts were restless. What could have happened? Maybe something serious happened at work. Or... Sophia dialed Artem's number again. The line was silent. She felt panic take over her completely. The night was long and sleepless. Sophia was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly out the window. Sleep did not come, and even fatigue could not overcome the anxiety that tore at her from the inside. Her phone lay nearby, a silent witness to her futile attempts to find a husband. With the first glimmer of morning light, the phone suddenly vibrated. Sophia almost jumped up, grabbed it, and saw an unknown number. My heart pounded. It could be Artem. "Hello?" she replied, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "Good morning, this is an ambulance doctor. Are you Sophia Artem's wife?" came a calm but professional voice. "Yes, it's me. What happened?" she asked, her voice beginning to break. "Your husband was involved in a traffic accident last night. He was taken to the hospital. His condition is stable, but he needs examination and follow-up. You should come." Sophia froze. Her thoughts were confused and her heart froze with mixed emotions, relief that he was alive and fear for his health. How did that happen? Where is he now, she asked, barely breathing. He was taken to the city hospital. The accident happened on the outskirts of the city. Can you come soon? Asked the doctor politely. Yes, I'm on my way, she answered quickly. Sophia threw the phone on the table and ran to the closet. Her hands were shaking as she dressed, her thoughts swirling around one thing. What happened to him? Why was he there on the outskirts? Sophia called a taxi and rushed to the hospital. The road seemed endless, although the city was already waking up, and life around was gaining momentum. Her heart was beating wildly as she got out of the car and entered the hospital lobby. Sophia ran out of the taxi, not noticing the cool morning. The young woman looked at her carefully, checking the information in the computer. Yes, your husband is here. He is in intensive care. The condition is stable. He's unconscious, the nurse said in a soft, sympathetic voice. Sophia felt the ground shake under her feet. Her world seems to have narrowed to these words. Serious condition. Unconscious. Can I see him? Please, I have to see him, she said, feeling her voice break. The nurse nodded and gestured for her to follow her. Their steps echoed through the empty corridor, and only one question sounded in Sophia's head. What happened to him? Why did this happen? They stopped in front of the door to the intensive care unit. The nurse carefully opened the door and let Sophia inside. Sophia froze when she saw Artem. He lay in a hospital bed connected to machines that beeped monotonously, monitoring his vital signs. His face was pale, a large gash was visible on his forehead, and his chest barely rose to the rhythm of the ventilator. What's wrong with him? Her voice trembled as she turned to the doctor standing next to her. The man in the white coat looked at her with professional seriousness. Your husband got into a serious car accident. He was taken to the hospital last night. He received a brain injury, as well as numerous bruises. We put him in a medically induced coma to give his body time to recover, the doctor explained. Now he is in a stable, serious condition, but we are doing everything possible. Sophia put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back her sobs. Her legs buckled, and she sat down in the chair next to the bed. She wanted to touch his hand, but she was afraid of causing him more pain. Will he live? She asked softly. We have every chance, but the next few days will be critical. You need to gather your strength, the doctor replied, his voice sounding sympathetic but offering no assurances. Sophia nodded, although her insides were torn by fear and pain. She looked at Artem, feeling completely powerless. All she could do now was wait. Sophia sat by Artem's bed, holding his cold hand. Her eyes were red from tears and sleepless nights. Silence reigned in the ward, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the machines supporting her husband's life. Suddenly, the door to the ward opened cautiously and 2 men in police uniforms entered. Sophia shuddered and sharply raised her head. Good afternoon, are you Sophia Artem's wife? Asked one of them, a short man with a serious face and a notebook in his hands. Yes, it's me, she answered, trying to keep her voice even though her heart was pounding so hard, it seemed it could be heard even across the room. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the accident your husband was in," he said, showing the ID. The second policeman, taller and silent, remained by the door, closely watching Sophia. "Accidents? I don't know anything. I only found out this morning that he was brought here," she said, trying to find words. The policeman sat on the chair opposite her, opened the notebook, and looked her in the eyes. "Your husband got into an accident on the outskirts of the city around 1 o'clock in the morning. We are investigating the circumstances. However, there are some issues that need clarification." Sophia nodded in confusion. "We received information that another vehicle may have been involved in this accident, but it disappeared from the scene. Do you know where your husband could be at this time?" the policeman asked, carefully watching her reaction. Sophia froze. Her heart stopped for a moment. She remembered last night, the car, the moment they left the man on the road. Her hands began to shake again. I don't know." "Artem did not tell me where he was going. He didn't answer my calls all night," she replied, looking down. The policeman continued without taking his eyes off her. "Do you have any suspicions about who he might have been dating or what might have happened before the accident?" Sophia shook her head. She felt herself panic but tried to control herself. "No, he didn't say anything. We didn't have any fights, nothing like that," she added, though her voice was shaking. The policeman carefully wrote down her words and nodded. "Okay, but if you think of anything, please contact us," he said, taking out a business card and placing it on the bedside table. "We hope your husband will recover quickly." He stood up, exchanged glances with his partner, and headed for the door. Sophia looked at them, trying to hold back the sobs that rose to her throat. When the door closed behind the policeman, Sophia put her head in her hands. Her brain was on edge. She understood that Artem's accident and the events of last night were somehow connected. But how? Did he see that man too? Is it just a coincidence? Sophia sat by Artem's bed, clutching his cold hand. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like pain. Her gaze was fixed on his pale face, and a terrible picture began to form in her head. That man on the road, their escape, the crash site. She suddenly realized the truth. It's them. They beat Artem down. Her body trembled, and she panicked inside. She clenched her hands so that her nails dug into her palms, trying to control herself. But the thoughts were uncontrollable. Artem was there, on the road when they were driving. Why? What was he doing there? Could he see them? Sophia grabbed the phone and, without thinking, dialed Alexei's number. Her fingers trembled as she put the phone to her ear. The beeps seemed endless until finally he answered. "Sophia, what happened?" His voice was strained. "Alexei! It's him! It was Artem!" Her voice broke and she began to cry. "We beat Artem, do you understand? It was him on the road!" There was silence at that end. Alexei was silent for so long that Sophia even thought he had hung up. "Are you sure?" he finally said, but his voice sounded not only disbelief but also fear. "I know it was him. Police said the accident happened on the outskirts of town around the time when it happened. Now he is in intensive care, in serious condition." Her words flowed in a stream. She could hardly breathe. "Damn it," Alexei whispered, and he could be heard exhaling heavily in the receiver. "We could not know. It was an accident, Sophie. We can't let it ruin our lives." "An accident! We left him there, Alexei. We didn't even stop to check." Her voice was full of anger and despair. "Calm down. We cannot change anything. If anyone finds out, we're both gone," he said softly. But his words hit like a blow. Sophia fell silent. She realized that he was right. Their secret was too dangerous to reveal. But how could she look into Artyom's eyes, knowing that they were to blame for his suffering? "What now?" she whispered. "Nothing. We are silent. Now you have to focus on behaving naturally. If you start to get nervous, the police will suspect something. Do you understand?" Alexei spoke quickly, but his voice was strained. Sophia silently nodded, although Alexei could not see it. Her hands trembled even more, and the tears welled up again. "I don't know if I can hide it," she said quietly. "You must, Sophia, for both of us," he answered sharply and hung up. Sophia was left alone with her phone in her hands. Her mind was seething with emotions, guilt, fear, despair. She looked at Artem, who was lying motionless on the hospital bed. What have I done? This question endlessly revolved in her head. But now she knew there was no going back. Alexei walked around his apartment like a driven animal in a cage. He replayed the latest events over and over in his head. That man on the road, the escape, Sophia's call, and the terrible realization that they had knocked Artem down. His hands were shaking and his heart was beating as if it wanted to explode. He knew that he had to act, and quickly. The car was the main evidence of their guilt. If the police find it and inspect it for damage, that's the end of it. But Alexei was too cautious to allow this. He decided, it is necessary to get rid of the car. Late in the evening, when the city was plunged into darkness, Alexei went out to his garage. He was wearing dark clothes and a cap that covered most of his face. His plan was clear, to create the illusion that the car was stolen. He got behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove to the outskirts of the city, to an abandoned area where he knew people rarely paid attention to abandoned things. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard that his fingers turned white. Every sound seemed suspicious to him, every shadow a stalker. An hour later, he stopped in an abandoned parking lot. There was not a single living soul around, only darkness and the sound of a distant train. He left the car with the doors open and threw the keys on the asphalt nearby to make it look like it had been stolen. No one will know, he told himself, feeling a cold sweat run down his back. Alexei returned on foot, avoiding main roads and surveillance cameras. At home, he immediately called the police, reporting the theft of the car. His voice sounded confident, but inside he could feel fear tearing him apart. My car was parked near the house. I came back late at night and found her gone. Yes, a black sedan, he explained to the operator. After the call, he leaned back on the sofa, taking a deep breath. He did everything he could to cover his tracks. But will that stop the police? The next day, Alexei received a call from the investigator who informed him that his statement had been accepted and that the search for the car had begun. He answered calmly, as if it didn't bother him much. However, thoughts about Sophia did not leave him. She could not stand the tension and speak. If that happens, his and her life will be ruined. He decided to call her. Sophia, I did as I planned. The car is no longer there. It is now stolen. The police won't be able to turn us in if you hang on, he said, trying to sound confident. I don't know, Alexei. It's all too much, she answered quietly, her voice shaking. Listen to me. If anyone finds out, you'll lose everything. Do you want Artem to know? Do you want the police to know? Just keep quiet. We'll get through this, he said, almost hissing. Sophia fell silent, but Alex felt that her doubts could become their biggest threat. Alexei sat in his apartment, looking at the dark window. He did the best he could, but fear continued to weigh on him. What if the police find the car? What if Sophia doesn't make it? His life turned into a constant nightmare from which there was no way out. Alexei sat in his apartment, sure that he had done everything to cover his tracks. The car is no longer there. The police believed his version of the abduction, but his peace was short-lived. Somewhere in the silence of the police station, the investigator was carefully reviewing the recordings of surveillance cameras installed along the road where the accident occurred. A camera installed on one of the nearby bridges captured the movement of cars that night. In the darkness of the rain, a black sedan was clearly visible, which was driving by at the exact moment when Artem was on the road. "Stop the video," said the investigator to his colleague. He leaned towards the screen, staring at the car's license plate. They matched the car that was reported stolen, another policeman confirmed. The investigator jotted something down in a notebook, then got up and made a phone call. Meanwhile, Alexei sat in his apartment trying to convince himself that everything was under control. He turned on the television, but the noise was not soothing. His phone suddenly vibrated, and Alexei's heart sank. It was a police number. He took a deep breath before answering. "Hello?" he said, trying to sound calm. "This is Investigator Soroka. We need to discuss some details of your stolen car claim. Will you be able to drive to the branch today?" The voice on the other end sounded professional, but persistent. "Of course," answered Alexei, trying not to show his excitement. "Did something happen?" "You will find out on the spot. We are waiting for you within an hour," said the investigator and ended the conversation. Alexei arrived at the station trying to look confident. The investigator met him in a small interrogation room. "Sit down," he said, inviting Alexei with a gesture. So what happened? Did you find the car? Asked Alexei, forcing himself to look casual. The investigator looked at him carefully. Yes, and we also found something interesting. Here, take a look, he said, turning on the surveillance footage. A black sedan driving down a dark road appeared on the screen. The license plate was clearly visible. This is your car, isn't it? Asked the investigator, not taking his eyes off Alexei. Alexei felt his heart sink. His lungs seemed to have stopped working. It could be a coincidence, he began, but the investigator raised his hand, stopping him. This car was recorded a few minutes before your husband Sophia was hit by a car, and now you claim that your car was stolen? The investigator leaned closer. Do you have something to explain it? Alexei realized that his plan had begun to collapse. He tried to think of something, but the words stuck in his throat. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe she was stolen before I noticed, he muttered, but even he could hear how silly it sounded. The investigator looked at him carefully. We will find out if it is so. But I recommend that you think about what you say next. If you hide something, it will only complicate the situation, he said, concluding the questioning. We have every reason to detain you until the circumstances are clarified. We need to make sure you're not withholding any information that would help the investigation, the investigator said, and nodded toward the door where 2 police officers were already standing. Wait, this is some absurdity. I didn't do anything. Alexei raised his voice, but the policemen were already approaching him. You have the right to a lawyer, and we will provide you with the opportunity to summon one, Soroka said while the police were handcuffing Alexei. His heart sank in despair. Everything he had planned so carefully was now destroyed. From now on, everything depended on Sophia. But will she have the strength to remain silent? Alexei was put in a temporary detention cell. He sat down on a cold bench, his head in his hands. Thoughts about what would happen next did not give him peace. Alexei sat in the cell, looking at the cracked concrete floor. His thoughts revolved around one thing. What now? Police already had enough evidence to link him to the crash, but he could not sit idle. The only thing he could do now was talk to Sophia, not to ask for help, but to let her know what was going on. He approached the door of the cell and addressed the guard. I need a phone call. I have a right to that, he said, trying not to show any strain. The guard nodded and after a few minutes led him to the call room. The old phone was on the table, surrounded by a surveillance camera. Alexei picked up the phone, dialed Sophia's number, and waited. Hello? Her voice sounded quiet but alarmed. It's me, Alexei, he said, taking a deep breath. I want you to know I was detained. Were you detained? For what? Her voice became strained. The police found recordings from surveillance cameras. They see that my car was at the scene of the accident. I told them she was kidnapped, but they doubt it, he explained briefly, trying to sound calm. What now? She asked, fear in her voice. Nothing. Let the police do their job. I said everything I could, he replied, holding back his emotions. Alexei, that's all. It's gone too far. Sophia paused, as if considering what to say next. Just live on. Don't take it upon yourself. This is my situation. I can handle it, he said, his voice firm. Sophia was silent, and he felt that she was struggling to find words. But he didn't want to involve her more than he already had. I just wanted you to know. Don't worry about me. Hang in there, he added before hanging up. Returning to the cell, Alexei felt strangely calm. He said everything he wanted to. He did not ask her to be silent, did not demand anything. If the police reach Sophia, she will decide for herself how to act. I don't need her help. I got myself into this, and I have to get out myself, he thought, sitting down on the bench. But in the depths of his soul, Alexei knew that hiding the truth was becoming more and more difficult, and this truth could destroy them both. It was quiet in the intensive care unit. Only the monotonous rhythm of the machines disturbed this silence. Sophia was sitting by Artem's bed, clutching his hand. Her eyes were red with tears, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Her heart was torn between the fear for his life and the horror of what he might remember. Suddenly, Artem moved. His fingers tightened around her hand, and his eyelids slowly lifted. Sophia held her breath as his eyes seemed to focus on her for a moment. Artem, you woke up. Her voice was filled with relief, but also hidden fear. Artem took a deep breath. His lips barely moved. Sophie, he whispered, and then his face contorted in pain and he closed his eyes. "Don't talk, you need rest," she said, trying to sound gentle, but inside she was panicking. Artem opened his eyes again, and his gaze became more focused. He looked at her, and suddenly his face filled with anxiety. "I remember," he said, trying to raise his head, but his weakness prevented him from doing so. Sophia squeezed his hand tighter, her heart froze. "What do you remember?" she asked, trying to look calm. Artem closed his eyes as if collecting his thoughts, and then quietly said, "Car, at night, rain." He stopped, gulping for air. "In the window, I saw you." These words hit Sophia like a thunderbolt. She felt the blood drain from her face and her heart freeze. She tried to stay calm, but her hands were shaking. "Artem, you must be confused. You were in shock, and the rain. It could all seem like it," she said, trying to sound convincing. But Artem shook his head. His gaze became more intense. "It was you, Sophia. I know it was you." His voice was weakening, but it sounded confident. Sophia could not find words. She felt the fear creeping over her more and more. If Artem remembers, if he realizes what really happened, her whole life will be ruined. "Artem, you are weak now. Maybe it's just jumbled memories. You need to rest," she whispered, holding back tears. Artem closed his eyes. His head fell on the pillow, but Sophia knew he remembers. And it's only a matter of time before he remembers everything down to the smallest details. She hurried out of the ward, her heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to jump out. She leaned against the wall in the hallway, gasping for air. "Now what? How do I hide it? Can I even hide it?" Thoughts swirled in her head. Sophia sat in the hospital corridor, clenching her hands so hard that her fingers turned white. Her heart was beating as if in a trap, and thoughts were swirling in her head, not giving her peace. Memories of that night, of Alexei, of the choice she made, seemed to eat her from the inside. When Artyom came to his senses and said that he saw her in the car window, she understood. There was no point in lying anymore. The truth would surface anyway, and she wanted her husband to know it from her. She took a deep breath, gathered all her strength, and returned to the ward. Artem was lying on the bed. His eyes were open, although he looked exhausted. "Artem," she said quietly, sitting down by his bed. Her voice trembled. "We need to talk." He slowly turned his head towards her, his gaze heavy. "You're hiding something, Sophie. I can feel it," he said, his voice weak but strained. Sophia felt her heart sink. She lowered her eyes, trying to collect herself. I have something to tell you, and I understand that you might hate me after this, but I can't live with this lie anymore," she began, barely holding back her tears. Artem was silent, listening carefully. Sophia took a deep breath and continued. "That night, when it happened, I was in the car, together with Alexei. We were driving, and we hit you, Artem. We got scared and ran away. I didn't even know it was you until I saw you here." She felt her voice break and tears rolled down her cheeks. She covered her face with her hands, unable to bear the weight of this moment. "Sophie," his voice was low and full of pain. He looked at her with such disappointment that she felt the ground split beneath her feet. "I didn't know it was you, Artem. We were scared. I was stupid and weak," she answered, her words flowing. "Were you with Alexei?" he asked, his eyes filled with a mixture of betrayal and anger. "Is that what I thought? Were you together?" Sophia lowered her head, not daring to answer. "Yes," she said almost inaudibly. "But it doesn't matter anymore. I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and now I want only one thing, for you to forgive me." Artem looked at her, was silent, and then turned his head away. His silence was even more painful than any words. "Forgive you?" he finally said. "Sophia, you broke me. Not only that night, you broke our life." Sophia cried, but did not try to justify herself. She knew what she had done and accepted his pain as her own. "I know I ruined everything, Artem, but I'm ready to do anything to fix it. You can hate me, you cannot talk to me, but I couldn't lie to you anymore." Artem was silent. His gaze was fixed on the ceiling, his face frozen in a mixture of pain and disappointment. "Go, Sophie," he said at last, quietly but firmly. "I need to think." She got up, barely able to stay on her feet, and left the ward. Her heart was broken, but inside she felt a strange relief. Now the truth had surfaced. What happens next depends on Artem. Sophia left the ward, her legs barely obeying. The hospital corridor seemed endless to her. She found a bench by the window and sat down with her head in her hands. Artem's words still echoed in her head. Go, Sophie. She was torn by feelings of guilt and fear. What if Artem doesn't forgive her? What if the police find out the truth? She couldn't hold it in anymore. But the confession did not bring her peace. It only opened new doors to pain. Her phone rang. Sophia pulled it out and saw the name Oleksiy. She hesitated, but eventually answered. What happened? She asked quietly. Sophia, I found out that Artem has come to his senses. What did he say? Does he remember anything? Oleksiy's voice was strained. Sophia was silent for a few seconds before answering. I told him everything, Oleksiy. He knows it was us. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Oleksiy burst out. What did you do? Sophie, do you understand that now everything is lost? If he goes to the police, we'll both be jailed. I don't care, she answered sharply, her voice shaking but determined. I could no longer live with this lie. He had a right to know. Oleksiy exhaled, and his voice became quieter but cold. You made a big mistake. Now everything depends on him. If he decides to turn us in, you can't fix it. Perhaps, said Sophia, barely holding back tears. But this is his right. I ruined his life, Oleksiy. I can't hide it anymore. Oleksiy fell silent, and Sophia heard him breathing heavily. Okay, he said after a long pause. But if he takes a step against us, I will not be silent. Did you understand? She didn't answer and just hung up. She was no longer worried about what would happen to Oleksiy. Her thoughts were only about Artem. Sophia returned to her apartment, but could not find a place for herself. She was tormented by thoughts about what would happen next. She was sitting by the window, staring into the darkness, when the phone vibrated again. It was a call from the hospital. Miss Sophia? This is the nurse from your husband's ward. He asked you to come. He wants to talk to you, she said. Sophia felt her heart freeze. What does he want? Will she be able to handle it? When she entered the room, Artem was sitting, leaning on pillows. His face was tense, but there was no anger in his eyes. He gestured for her to sit down. I've been thinking about everything you said, he began slowly. And although I still can't believe that this happened, I understand that you came to me with the truth. Sophia looked at him, not knowing what to say. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I know one thing. Hate won't fix anything, he said, his voice even. Artem, she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. I will not go to the police. Not because of you, but because of myself. I don't want my life to be even more ruined by this, but I can't just forget either, he said. Sophia cried, tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief. She knew he wasn't ready to forgive her, but he gave her a chance. Sophia returned home after talking with Artem, feeling exhausted, but at the same time, as if for the first time in a long time, she was breathing heavily. Her confession, although it destroyed their relationship, was the first step towards seeing the truth about herself. She sat down on the sofa, looking out the window. The evening sun flooded the room with warm light, but it was dark inside. Her life turned into chaos because of her own decisions. Artem was the only man she truly loved, and only now, after everything, did she realize it. How could I lose him? How could I betray him? Thoughts tore her apart. She remembered their happy moments, walks in nature, quiet evenings at home, his sincere smile when he looked at her. It seemed so far away now. Sophia realized that her relationship with Oleksiy was a mistake. Not love, but an escape from reality, from problems that she did not dare to solve. She didn't need Oleksiy. She needed Artem, his support, his faith, his love. And now that he knew about her betrayal, she feared that she had lost him forever. Meanwhile, in the ward, Artem talked with the policeman who came to clarify the details of his testimony. Mr. Artem, we know that you have reason to believe that your wife and the man we detained may be involved in the accident, said the officer, holding a notebook. Are you ready to testify so that we can continue the investigation? Artem was silent for a long time. His eyes were looking out the window, behind which the gray sky promised rain. He ran Sophia's words over and over in his head. She cheated on him, but she also confessed. She cried and begged for forgiveness. Her pain seemed real, but could he forgive? Artem looked at the officer. I withdraw my statement, he said quietly but firmly. Are you picking it up? Are you sure? The officer was clearly surprised. This may complicate your further relationship if it really was their fault. I'm sure, repeated Artem without changing his tone. This is my decision. The officer nodded, jotted down something in a notebook, and left, leaving Artem alone with his thoughts. He knew his choice wasn't logical, but he didn't want to turn his life into even more chaos. Hatred will only destroy him. Alexei found out about his dismissal the same day. He was sitting in the cell when the investigator came to him. "You are free," he said coldly. The victim took away his statement. "But I wouldn't tempt fate again if I were you." Alexei could not believe it. The feeling of relief was mixed with anxiety. He knew that Artyom could act for a reason. But now he was free, and this gave him a chance to rethink everything. When he went outside, he immediately dialed Sophia. "I was released," he said shortly. "I know," Sophia replied, her voice calm but cold. "This is Artem." He took the statement. "Did he take the statement?" Alexei was clearly surprised. "And what now?" "Now, everything between us is over, Alexei. I don't want to see you anymore. It was a mistake, and I'm trying to fix it," said Sophia, barely holding back tears. "Don't call me anymore." "Sophia, listen," he began, but she had already hung up. Sophia returned to Artem's room. She entered quietly, her heart beating fast. Artem was lying on the bed, looking at the ceiling. "You took the statement," she said, sitting down next to him. He looked at her, his eyes filled with weariness and a mix of emotions she couldn't quite place. "Yes, I decided that it would not lead to anything good," he said. "But this does not mean that I have forgotten everything." Sophia nodded, lowering her head. It was hard for her to look him in the eye. "Artem, I know that I deserve your hatred, but I'm willing to do anything to make it right," she said, her voice shaking. "I love you, always have, and only now I realized how much." Artem looked at her for a long time and then quietly answered, "You have to prove it, Sophia. Not with words, but with actions. We'll start over, but it won't be easy." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She knew that her road to forgiveness would be long and difficult, but she was willing to go through it if it meant a chance to restore their love. Several months have passed since that fateful night. Artem continued to recover from his injuries, and Sophia left her job to be by his side. She decided to devote her time to caring for her husband and trying to restore their relationship. Their communication was difficult. Artem kept his distance, and although he was not rude, Sophia felt that the wall between them had not yet been destroyed. But she did not give up. She proved every day that her words of love and remorse were true. Alexei disappeared from their lives. After Artem took the statement, he no longer tried to contact Sophia. She realized that their romance was just an escape from reality, and now she didn't want to live a lie anymore. She needed a new beginning. One morning, when Artyom could already walk without help, they went for a walk together. Sophia timidly took his hand, and he did not push her away. It was a small but important step for both of them. "Thank you for giving me another chance," she said quietly, looking at him. "You had the right not to do it, but I'm grateful that you gave me a chance to make things right." Artem stopped, looked her in the eyes, and said, "I gave you a chance, but forgiveness is more difficult. You must understand that trust is not returned immediately." "I know," she replied, her voice shaking, "but I am ready to wait as long as necessary. You are the most important thing to me." He nodded silently, and they continued walking. Sophia felt that this was another small step forward. Time passed, and life began to return to a normal rhythm. Sophia started working again, but now she chose projects that allowed her to spend more time at home. Artem, albeit slowly, began to open up to her again. They laughed together, watched old movies, and began to restore what was destroyed. One evening they were sitting on the balcony watching the sunset. Artem suddenly said, I thought maybe we could really start over. Not as before, but in a new way, from a clean sheet." Sophia looked at him, tears of joy welling up in her eyes. "That's all I want, Artem. I am ready to do everything for this," she said. He smiled, genuinely for the first time in a long time. "Then let's try," he said, taking her hand. Sophia understood that the road to true forgiveness and love was still long, but now they had a chance, and she wasn't going to lose him.